Oh, good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, we don't have a microphone, so we'll have to stretch a bit our voices and ask you to be a bit quiet with that. But welcome, everyone, to our panel on conversations on careers at the United Nations in collaboration with the British Association of Former UN Civil Servants. This panel was made possible with support of the KCL World Study Societies. Thank you very much. My name is Alberto Martino. I'm the Secretary General of Lyman UC 2026, and today I'm co-moderating this panel with Nadia.
Hi, I'm Nadia. I am the president of the World Study Society here at Cambridge. We run a bunch of events, including conflict for different speakers, panels, careers, events, that sort of thing. So if you're interested in anything around that sphere, you might want to come to other events. We're on Instagram and we have our own WhatsApp group. If you're interested, come talk to me after this and I'll give you the links.
And just for introduction, for the Lyman Foundation is the largest multi-United Nations conference here in Europe. We do run an annual conference by 3 very special guests. Please have a big round of applause for our guests. Just to give you a brief introduction, we've got 3 guests tonight. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we're going to move on to a small presentation on BAFAs, an introduction to careers at the UN. We're going to then proceed with some questions for a conversation again on pros and cons, insights in careers at the UN. And then we're going to open up the floor to you, the in-person audience and our online audience. So feel free to, if you're online, leave your questions in the chat, or if you're in person here, start thinking about them. You have the chance to ask them in around 30 to 40 minutes. But this being said, let me introduce Nicholas Rosellini, who served as UN Resident Coordinator and the highest level representative of the UN in China from 2016 until his retirement. Prior to this, he served as UNDP Deputy Assistant Administrator and Deputy Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific, and also as Director of the Bangkok Regional Hub. He has also served as UN Resident Coordinator, a UNDP Resident Representative in Bhutan, and previously in various capacities in UNDP, including in Vietnam, in Pakistan, in Ethiopia, and in Ghana. Next up, we've got Alison. Well, we're going to skip up at the end. Alison has spent 29 years working within the UN system, 16 years with UNICEF UK, focusing on fundraising, communications, and influencers, and working closely with UNICEF headquarters and country operations. And most recently, 13 years as Chief of the Global Goodwill Ambassador Program at the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. She has also worked for the National Council of YMCAs, Care International, and Barnardo's, and served as a trustee for Alzheimer's Research UK. Alison read history at the University of Cambridge, and she has 3 daughters. Megan Hovvels is a trainee solicitor specializing in public law and human rights. She's currently training through the VPP Apprenticeship in Law at Dayton Pierce Clinic, where she works in a Amit Hayat public law team. She has a master's degree in human rights and refugee law, and she has experience working with the UNHCR's legal protection team on asylum and international protection matters. Her voluntary work includes supporting displaced children, family reunion, and a frontline asylum service with Children Not Numbers, Together Now, and Bristol Refugee Rights. Again, please welcome our guests for tonight. Nicholas to deliver his brief presentation on the UN system.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting us. I've been doing these kind of conversations for about 3 years now. That's being at the beginning of 2026, I have to be honest at the outset that the time is very complex, very difficult for the United Nations and for those who have an interest in a career in the United Nations. We just had the Secretary General here in London. He met the Prime Minister. He opened, together with the President of the General Assembly, the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the first UN General Assembly, which you mentioned. There were many panels, many speakers, quite eminent speakers. And there was a whole spectrum of views in terms of the future of the United Nations. Some just saying, oh, we need to tighten our belts and we'll weather the storm, a little bit complacent perhaps, through to the other extreme of the spectrum, that if the UN doesn't undergo fundamental root and branch reform and update the charter, that the UN will really die and go away. So I hope for those who are interested to work in the United Nations, you'll hear enough today to encourage you, to inspire you to keep to that dream. But I have to acknowledge at the start that it is a very difficult time to be looking at such careers. The purpose of this presentation is just to give a little bit of background context in terms of careers in the United Nations and what the UN looks like if you're looking at it from the outside. I think everyone knows the main functions of the United Nations, but it's worth repeating them in terms of peace and security, development and humanitarian work, and human rights. These are all mutually reinforcing, and many people work across these various roles of the United Nations. Many people might think of the UN, oh, the UN, that's the Security Council, that's the Permanent Five, that's the General Assembly, but in reality, the UN, of course, is much bigger than that. These are just some of the logos of some of the principal agencies that are part of the United Nations. And to really zoom in, here we are. This is the official organization chart of the United Nations. And most of us have only worked in a tiny fraction of that. You'll see there that, well, you probably won't, it's quite small print, but there are 30 main departments of the United Nations Secretariat. On top of that, there are 37 agency funds and programs, such as the UN Development Program, UNICEF, UNHCR, the Refugee Agency, and many technical agencies that set standards and norms, such as the Food and Agriculture Organization, ICAO, dealing with civil aviation, the Drug Control Organization, and so on and so forth. So that's all part of the broader UN system. And it's important to know, in looking at this, and especially if you're applying for jobs, that most of them, I mean, the 37 agencies, plus the 30 departments of the UN, they all have their own governance, they have their own board of directors, they do their own fundraising, and they do their own recruitment. So the UN Secretariat has centralized recruitment for the 30 departments, but then all these other agencies have their own recruitment needs and requirements, they do their own fundraising, and they have their own governance. So we're not talking about one unified UN system, particularly when it comes to recruitment issues. UN system revenue peaked in 2022, $74 billion. Last couple of years for which we have the data, 23 and 24, it was around $67 billion. I think when we see 25 and 26, we'll see significant reductions, but we don't have the data for that yet. The current funding crisis is affecting wide parts of the UN system beyond these numbers. There have been very deep cuts in humanitarian agencies, and there are very significant arrears in payment. We often hear about the US not paying, but actually there are 54 nations that have not paid on time. So there's both arrears and real cuts. Another characteristic, particularly if you're looking which part of the UN you might want to work in, is how split the funding is. If you look here, I mean, you see a few agencies receiving a large amount of resources and many getting very little indeed. And it's, I mean, most money that the UN receives is tied is either tied by a donor to a specific issue or to a specific country, and it's not money that can be used by the United Nations according to the priorities of the countries it operates in. It's very much tied. The blue bar is, the red bar is the tied contributions. The only major area of the work of the United Nations which is assessed, which is like a tax on the member states, is the peacekeeping operations, which is the very tall blue bar. Almost all the rest of the resources of the UN system are voluntary resources and are often tied. So when you're looking at jobs in the UN, you have to bear that in mind in terms of where job prospects might be. Similarly, with the numbers of personnel, in 2024 there are around 130,000. Again, 2025, 2026, we'll see that dip significantly. But the 130,000, you can add to that the people who are not on staff contracts, people who are on short-term contracts, consultants, interns, and so on, which probably doubles that figure, or more than doubles that figure. We can see this year many agencies are announcing cuts of around 20% in personnel. I mean, some are a bit more, some are a bit less, but around the 20% mark. Now, this is not necessarily all bad news. If one looks at the figures, probably what is happening this year and the cutbacks will still leave the UN system, which has about the same revenue and the same personnel staffing as, let's say, a decade ago. So it's not that we're going to zero, but it will be a significant trimming of the UN back to levels earlier this century. But there'll still be attrition, there'll still be job openings, they'll be more difficult, there'll be less of them. The morale of people already in the UN will be worse, but there'll certainly be opportunities given the large volume of staffing of the United Nations. Entry-level jobs will frankly be less, what we call the P1, P2. P1 have already vanished in earlier downsizing. P2, I think, will vanish in these current downsizing. So the way entry points will not necessarily be initially staff jobs. You'll have to be looking again at consultancy type arrangements that the UN has and internships. These are some job sites I'm sure you're quite familiar with them. LinkedIn is a very good place to look. A lot of UN staff are on LinkedIn and contact people there. So I want to leave just with a quote from the Secretary General from the 17th of January when he was in London, and he was making a speech at the celebration of the first General Assembly meeting. He said there is a persistent myth now echoing louder each day that peace is naive, that the only real politics is the politics of self-interest and force. But the founders of the United Nations were not untouched by reality. On the contrary, they had seen war and they knew peace, justice, and equality are the most courageous, the most practical, the most necessary pursuits of all. And I hope for many of you, you will be inspired and interested to join the UN at some point in your careers, even if this is not the most optimal time to be looking at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to conversations, some questions we prepared for you. But in a couple of minutes time, I mean, in 20 to 30 minutes, it will be your chance to ask questions, right? So make sure to prepare something for the online audience. And when we do prepare these events, we always like to understand your honest opinion about the UN itself and be completely transparent here. Most of you probably, if not everyone, will want to understand the reality of working at the UN directly. So I don't think we're here to encourage anyone to say that working at the UN is easy or that it's easy to get into, but we're here to frame the situation transparently and to put things clearly into what's actually happening now in the UN. So These questions will guide us through the conversation, and I'm sure great insights will come through. But yeah, I'll leave it to Nadia for the questions.
All right, so this is a question for all of our speakers. So why and how did you first join the UN, and in what stage of your career did that occur? If you would like to start first.
There's water afterwards.
Sorry, apologies.
I joined the UN in a path that is probably not very realistic nowadays. I want to say that at the outset, because I joined straight out of university, which now is more or less impossible because you need a 3 years, in many cases, work experience before you can be considered for the United Nations. I knew I wanted to look for work that was more values driven, that I could feel fulfilled in and felt I could contribute in a small way in terms of social progress. I didn't know, I was an economist by training, but I didn't quite know where to work, and I eventually applied for something called the Junior Professional Officer Program, which sponsoring governments pay for 2 years contract. So you get 2 years work experience that way. I was sent to Ghana, and I found the work extremely interesting. Ghana at that time was coming out of a long period of economic decline and was restructuring the economy, and the UN was quite involved in that. And the work was extremely interesting and very fulfilling. Also, in hindsight, maybe back then I thought it was my right, but I found it very empowering. I think I was given a lot of authority and a lot of responsibility at a relatively young age with very little experience, which I greatly enjoyed, but in hindsight was probably maybe premature. But it is, even nowadays, I think you'll find when you join the United Nations, you do get a lot of responsibility put on you. It's, even at entry levels. So I think that was a big plus point. After that, I applied to the competitive entry program for the UN Development Program. I joined it successfully and found it extremely interesting, and moving assignment every 3-4 years or so really kept the work fresh and interesting. It was like having a new job every few years, even though you're within the same career structure. So I spent about 35 years working in the UN. I finished in China. I enjoyed every assignment I had, and I do it all over again. So I thoroughly recommend it.
Nice.
I might be a good follow-up because I did join straight after uni, so it's not absolutely impossible, but it was through an internship through 2024 and 2025. So just a 9-month window with UNHCR in London. And there is definitely a lot of truth to what you said. I joined with 2 other interns, and they both had professional experience. I had NGO experience, and I was finishing my master's postgrad, as was another one. So they're definitely, it is very competitive at entry level, and it was a fantastic experience. I was working in the legal protection team in the London office, and had the opportunity to work on some policy development in the UK as well. But it is very hard to find entry-level positions. Like the gap between the internship and the P1s or P2 roles that you were talking about is very big, and it's very uncommon, or it doesn't really happen that interns are kept on to progress into a professional permanent role. But it was a fantastic insight to how it operated and how it works.
So I think it's quite useful that I have quite a different experience to Nicholas, and this is quite an important message to all of you, which is that you can join the UN later in your career, hopefully. It still exists, which I'm sure it will. There's a great need for it. So I didn't even have it on my radar when I graduated. I did know that I wanted go into a career that's very sort of purpose driven. And I started working with charities, NGOs in the UK. So what I did was build my skill set around communications, fundraising, advocacy, and, for want of a better word, influence. So it really sort of came into my purview in my 30s and 40s, actually. So you've got a long way to go. I first went to UNICEF UK, and this is the other part of the picture for some of the humanitarian agencies, is, as Nicholas alluded to, government contributions are going down. And it's increasingly important for these agencies to raise funds from a broad range of sources: individuals, civil society, corporates, foundations, etc., etc. So they rely on, some of them have a network of national committees and national partners, which are separately instituted charities that are there to support the UN agency. So UNICEF UK is registered in the UK. Sole purpose is to raise funds, awareness, advocate for UNICEF. So if you work in one of those national committees, as I did initially, the membrane between the national partner and national committee and the UN agency is very porous. So you are actually working day to day with UN colleagues, UNICEF colleagues all around the world, traveling, seeing the operations quite seamlessly. So the first thing I did was set up a fundraising partnership. If you've ever been on a BA flight and seen those little envelopes that you put your coins in or whatever you put in them, I started that scheme back in the 90s when it was called Change for Good for UNICEF, and it raised many millions. And then I did various other things, but then I ended up setting up their ambassador program in the UK, which was really servicing a lot of the global work. So I recruited people like Jemima Khan, David Beckham, Ray Fons, various people to be ambassadors. And the reason we have those is they help us with communication, with advocacy, with fundraising, and you'd be amazed the doors that open for people of influence. So we would travel the world, see the programs, and do that advocacy work. So I set up, if any of you know Soccer Aid, with Robbie Williams' team, I set up Soccer Aid. If you've ever seen the TV programs, Long Way Round, Long Way Down, I worked with McGregor. So it was taking the influence and networks of those people, producing media, producing TV, film, as well as the fundraising and advocacy to government leaders. Then I moved to UNHCR to set up their Goodwill Ambassador program. So again, it was about setting the strategy, building the team, recruiting, bringing in ambassadors. So we had Kate Blanchett, Ben Stiller, and actually 50% of those were people with lived experience of displacement. If you think of the Refugee Olympic team, for example, which I'm very proud of. So again, we would take them into the UN Security Council, Davos, European Parliament, Capitol Hill, doing that advocacy work and generating support and awareness, and hopefully some empathy, including for refugees. I left UNHCR 2024, so I work as a consultant now. So I'm actually working with Kate Blanchett on something called, give me a plug here, Displacement Film Fund. So we've set up a film fund to support displaced filmmakers. First premieres next week. But I really want you to, it's really important that a lot of people think UN, as you say, peace and security. There's such a breadth of opportunity across all the different agencies. You know, I only sat in the sort of hub of humanitarian and development with those agencies that I worked with, very small in the bigger picture. And what I saw was, you know, people that brought very technical skills. In other agencies, I've done talks with people who've got skills in agriculture, skills in law, skills in data management, skills in finance, and then there's the softer skills, the communication skills, the advocacy skills that run across that are also really, really important. So I think you can really successfully build your careers in other areas, in other organisations that will equip you to come into the UN at different stages in your career journey.
let's move on to another question, another one for all of you. Now, could you list a couple of pros and cons that you've found while working at the UN? Nicholas, if you'd like to start. Yeah.
I think at the personal level, there are not many careers where you can really mix and be exposed to so many different cultures and different environments around the world. Even if you're only working in New York or in Geneva in the headquarters, you'll find people from every nationality from around the world. So I think it is an enormous advantage, a pro of working for the United Nations is its diversity around the world and the way and its diverse workforce. It makes the work extremely fulfilling. It helps to make it very fulfilling. I think on the work side, you're working for an organization that takes a long-term view. It's not bound by 5-year cycles or 3-year cycles. It can look at intergenerational issues in a meaningful way. It can look at for climate change or the Sustainable Development Goals. These are very much long-term commitments, and the UN has an ability to look at these much longer range issues, which I think is extremely important in the world. Another plus, I think, is you can actually zoom in and zoom out. You can work at a very micro level. You can work at a very macro policy level. You can work on big global issues around the environment, climate change, or you could be working on a small forestation project in a small part of a drought-prone country. You can be working on the Global Conventions on Human Rights, or you can be doing a women's empowerment project in a village. So you can both see practically the impact at the grassroots level, the local level, or you can be involved in issues that shape thinking at the global level. And I think you can specialize, or you can look at, you can sometimes jump between the two. So I think that also makes it very interesting. On the cons, the United Nations is an intergovernmental organization. All of the agencies which are part of the system, they're all intergovernmental organizations. And often things have to work on consensus. This can mean compromises. This can mean sometimes very long drawn out decision-making processes, which can be frustrating sometimes. But there we are. Then on the personal level, it can play havoc with your family, whether it's at various stages in your life, whether it's moving with your partner, because most countries don't offer visas to partners, work visas. I mean, they'll give a visa, but not a work visa. So that can complicate matters. It can mean if you have children later in life, how will you settle them? What culture, environment will you settle them in, and so on. So, I mean, it can be very difficult in terms of family life, but certainly on the professional life, it's extremely fulfilling and interesting way of life, and I think a lot of pros.
Megan, would you like to follow up?
I mean, you spoke to so many of the positives and give a really rounded view, but from my time, one of the things I valued definitely the most working at UNHCR was the really unique and sort of collaborative role that you get to have with public services or governments in domestic countries. Having come from an NGO background and now being quite an activist law firm who's always suing the government, it's really fantastic at UNHCR or other UN agencies to work alongside the government and public services. Like I had the opportunity to train members of staff at the Home Office and then in turn also receive training. And I think that there's so much to leverage in a more collaborative relationship. And to be able to guide policy and work collaboratively, I think there's so much to be achieved there. And obviously working with the UN, you have so much swing when you look at what happened with Rwanda intervening and keeping the planes on the ground. I think that there's a lot of power behind the thing. There's a lot of justification. Things that you speak to was surprising, and I think, as has been mentioned a few times, and I don't want to go on about the same thing too long, but it is really bottlenecked with entry-level positions at the moment. So it's just very difficult to have a job. And the way that, well, I understand the UNHCR works is you have local staff and then you have international staff. And I think if you don't have, like the international staff generally tend to be more further along in their career, more professional. And then that comes with the difficulty that you spoke to about moving to different country offices. Like UNHCR boasts the highest divorce rate among UN agencies, which I think can get awfully complicated later in life when you have a family to think about. But also it's difficult to progress if you aren't at that later level in your career where you're quite senior and you're a more likely candidate for the international roles, because the local roles can sometimes, I think there's quite a big gap between the two roles, so it can be difficult to make that transition. And that's what I saw for a lot of my colleagues at UNHCR. They were quite senior in their local roles, but still quite far off being a likely candidate for the international roles, which I think are becoming ever more competitive.
Megan, I'm going to follow up with another question, given your internship at the UNHCR. Did the UN internship itself change your career perspective after that, or maybe it didn't? And if it did, hopefully, how did it change it? Did anything else sparking you? Do you feel like it was the right choice? You feel like you realized maybe that sector was for you, or you completely discovered something that you didn't know at the time? But we're eager to know your perspective on this.
I think there's a very good example of the work that I did at UNHCR, which sort of demonstrates the aspiration I had to continue working in the sector of broader humanitarianism and assistance for refugees. We were working on the 28-day challenge. And at the time when I was at UNHCR, we were writing a report, and the 28 days is the amount of time that an asylum seeker in the UK has to leave their hotel accommodation or asylum accommodation and move into public service accommodation or private accommodation. And I was working on a report explaining why it's a very short window for people to move on. People weren't able to access the services they needed. And when I was at UNHCR, through writing this support and having conversations with the Home Office, we were able to negotiate and support them in implementing a 56-day policy where they had 56 days instead to move on to public services, which, I mean, it was a really dangerous point for asylum seekers or newly granted refugees. Many of them were becoming street homeless. And, having worked at an NGO supporting people in that position and feeling like you're sort of pushing a boulder up a hill for one person and you're not getting anywhere, being able to sit there directly with the Home Office, explain it to them, have them actually listen in rather than just sending pre-action letters that are being ignored or responded to when they're aggressive enough, definitely felt like a massive development in that sort of in that one and it really did open my eyes to the value of diplomacy and working alongside the government in a much more pragmatic and collaborative way. But then on the flip side, this pilot has now been stopped, and in my current role, where I work in a public law firm, we're now presenting legal challenge to reinstate the policy and to challenge the suspension of it. And I just think that speaks to it. If you want to work in this sector where you're just helping and supporting, I guess, and providing humanitarian assistance, it's such a broad field and there's so many avenues to it. And I just feel like the internship at UNHCR really helped to guide me into different avenues to do that work, and it also propelled me forward as a much more confident and capable candidate for the position I'm now in, where I'm working on the same cause but in a slightly different way.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to get back to you. You mentioned earlier how the UN careers can be so varied. It means there's a plurality of skills that one could have and could fit in one of the boxes that we've seen before. But the question that comes natural of is, if that many skills can be applicable to any role, what is that everyone's linked? What's the skill that links everyone in that sense? And what advice would you give to someone who would like to apply, or especially given that you've joined later on in your career, what skills did you see that was different from the people you've worked before joining the UN itself? And I'm going to start with you, and then if you have anything else to any speaker, feel free to do so.
I think for any job in any organisation, you just need to be really clear about what your specific skills are and your competences, and you need to be targeted. You need to think quite strategically about your skill sets and where you want your career to go and what you need in terms of knowledge, experience, the hard skills, but also thinking about the transferable skills and the competences, so your communication skills, your team building skills, your organisational skills, your problem and conflict resolution skills, that make you an attractive proposition. I mean, I don't think there is one, I don't think you can pinpoint one set of skills that delineates UN employees from anybody else. We're all in the market, and we all have to have attractive and transferable skills, right? So it's the lens through which you look at what you've got and how you present yourself, really. I mean, do you want me to do any? We're past pros and cons now, is that? Yes.
If you
I
like
guess.
by all means.
I mean, for me, I won't say much because actually time's ticking on and you've said pretty much all of it. But the opportunity to work to contribute to international and humanitarian affairs, to work with such a diverse group of colleagues, to be able to travel to so many different locations. For me, one minute I might be sitting somewhere in a remote community with refugees or children in host communities, and the next minute we might be going to meet with somebody, a minister, a prime minister, a president, or at some kind of A-list event or whatever. That mix of things, and having the sort of the humanitarian agencies, the dirty boot, working out in very difficult environments, and then the clean shoe of the diplomacy at the highest level. It's an incredible opportunity to be exposed to those. And one of the things that certainly in the agencies I've worked in is fantastic is, people rotate, and there's something called functional flexibility. So people have the opportunity to try, once you're in, to move around different departments, different regional offices, different disciplines, actually. So, a friend of mine who was the camp manager in Zartri refugee camp in Jordan is now the head of innovation at headquarters, because there's a lot of currency also put on knowing the organisation, knowing how it works. And on the cons, I would say there can be hierarchy. There's definitely bureaucracy that you've got to be quite resilient to work within and with and get through. Movement between categories can be different. You're right to point out there are also, beyond the international roles, P1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, Ds, 1s, 2s, there are national officer roles as well, which don't rotate, which stay rooted in their country office, and sometimes it can be quite hard to move from one to the other. And the cuts, I have to say, the cuts in the budgets now is definitely problematic. In UNHCR, 6,500 jobs were cut last year, so it's pretty tough.
Well, I know we all talked, I think Nicholas talked about becoming a contractor as a pathway into the UN and to work with the UN. And you also mentioned that you worked as a contractor as well. This is generally a question.
I didn't know.
Oh, you didn't work as a contractor, I'm sorry. But no, so then I guess this would be a question for Nicholas then. Could you speak more about the different sorts of roles that contractors play within the UN, different examples of what one might do as a contractor to work with
Well, I suppose it's a bit like an onion. I mean, you've got a core, which you actually call the core staff, and which is a far, far smaller percentage than a decade ago, 20 years ago. These are people who get all the benefits and compensation of a staff contract. I mean, it's quite a similar thing that's happened in private companies and in governments, in the public sector as well. So you have a shrinking core, and then since the work still has to be done, a lot of budgetary positions are monetized. So instead of having 10 posts, you get cash in lieu of maybe half of those. And with that, you can go and hire consultants, people on short contracts which have no expectation of renewal, which can actually last for several years. It's more legal term than short, meaning it's very short. You can get renewed. You might start on a 3-month contract, and then you get a 6-month, and then maybe someone will renew you for another 6 months, and before you know it, you've been renewed for a couple of years. The terms and conditions are not the same as if you have a staff contract. You don't get any pension payments, you're subject to tax, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, if you're trying to build up your CV, if you're trying to show you have several years work experience, if you want to make contacts within the UN system, which is very important, and get yourself known as a reliable worker who can produce reports on time, can do research accurately, and so on, it is a very good way in. Most of these positions are advertised in the same way that staff positions are advertised. So that it is reasonably transparent. But it always helps if you know someone within the hiring unit, whether it's a department in the headquarters or whether it's an office in a particular country. It certainly helps. So I think if you're looking to build up your work experience, it's certainly worth looking at these kind of consultancy opportunities and see whether that builds on work experience so you can be a competitive candidate for a post later on. But just to add to that, I think with the staffing situation in the UN now, it's probably good to be flexible and not to look at the UN as a linear progression, but rather something where you have that as maybe an objective over the long term. You know, you want to work with refugees, let's say, and maybe ultimately you'd like to be working in UNHCR. But along the way, you're willing, as you're doing, work for a law firm, work for an NGO, do some consultancies for the UN, and look at it all as part of the same process leading up to perhaps a longer-term job at the UN.
Is this question through?
No, sorry.
Okay. Well, I'm going to lead on from what
yeah.
you said, because actually I'm just going to give you some practical tips then and go through some things, because I've recruited a lot of interns over the last 2 decades, and a lot of consultants actually when posts that I had in my team were cut. I used the money to do short-term consultancies of different things. So you've really got to be alert and proactive if you want to get an opportunity of some exposure, particularly early on in the UN. And probably internships is the place to look. Now, the website was up there, careers.un.org. Just go on there and search internships. I had a look and I wrote down, and they're fewer than they used to be, but they're there all around the world. So, for example, information and comms technology in New York, economic affairs in New Delhi, environmental analyst Panama, UN Web TV New York, Turkey testing UNICEF's emergency monitoring platform. There's all sorts. So you just need to look, and then you need to know, and I'm sure you get good coaching here at KCL on your job applications and how to do a great application and how to do a great interview, because there's definitely tips and hacks to doing that. And I used to get 300 applications for an internship, so believe me, you need to make sure it's tailored and not generic. And you really need to read it, and you really need to show why you're interested, what skills and experience you've got that are relevant, doesn't matter, you know, from any walk of your life, and show that you actually have looked into the job. A number of times I interviewed someone and I said, so tell me about one of the UNHCR Goodwill Ambassadors, and they'd go, oh, I haven't had time to look. You know, I don't think you really want this, but somebody else does. So do have a look on the UN, the main UN careers page, but every agency, and again, I can only speak for humanitarian agencies, they have their own careers websites too. So you have to look across multiple and just keep going back and checking. But those opportunities do exist. Mostly they're paid. I hope they're all paid now. We paid ours. They weren't, but you know, nevertheless, it's a type,
very modest,
minimum wage level. And obviously, you have to be able to work in that location. So you do need to know that you can actually work in whichever country the internship is. You can get your visa. You may not get support from the agency with that. You might have to sort that. Short-term consultancy contracts. Now, I've done panels, and Nicholas, you have as well, with younger colleagues who are, in some circumstances, still doing their masters, but have also managed to get short-term consultancy contracts, very specialist. For example, one panel I did, there was a guy who was doing his masters in epidemiology, and he was working for the World Health Organization on a very specific project. 3 months by 3 months, he had to be tenacious. You know, he had to keep going back and getting it renewed. And he was doing that while studying. So you do have to put the graft in, but those opportunities might exist. And I know interns that have really proved the mettle do sometimes succeed in getting short-term internship consultancies, but you do have to be prepared to be super flexible and resilient. There is the junior professional officer scheme still that Nicholas started on. That's not for every nationality. It's certain governments that sponsor these schemes, but that you can go on the JPO web pages. You can have a look at those. I think it's developed countries that are underrepresented. And then there's also a young professionals program which exists, and that is entry exam for talented individuals, specifically to go and work and be trained in the secretariat. Again, they target underrepresented countries. I've seen so many people come into the UN, and again, humanitarian agencies, from NGOs, INGOs, civil service, journalism, many different disciplines, digital, finance, increasingly innovative finance, coming in from different organisations, from those national partners and national committees, where that, as I say, that membrane is quite porous. There's also UN volunteers, over 18, but usually you need more experience. Again, you've got to think about the resourcing and whether you can afford to do that, because support is quite limited. But beyond that, because it is so competitive, do you think about what you can do in your spare time, voluntarily as well, that really shows your passion and interest. And there are lots of organisations that offer internships and voluntary that will add to your CV. You mentioned LinkedIn. Build your LinkedIn, join the right groups, network, show your interest on your social, or maybe check your social for posts that aren't so appropriate. And then lastly, I'd say there are hygiene factors, the basics, your languages. Make sure you've got your languages if you want to go into international UN career, a UN language. So one English +1, usually. Make sure you've got the right qualifications. Make sure you've got the ability to, if it's a consultancy in particular, you've got the ability to travel and work in the right locations, and it's a non-political, you know, you're in that world. So if you are interested in many of the issues that UN deals with, but feel you're more of an activist, more political, more outspoken, there's lots of organisations you can work for, but the UN might not be for you, and you do need to, I think there's times when everyone's had to, you know, everyone has views, but you don't bring them to work, and there are codes of conduct that require you to always remember that you're a diplomat. So that's not for everybody either, and that is fine.
I have just one thing to add, because obviously not so long ago, I think I was in this situation where I was thinking, what are the other sort of segues into organizations like UNHCR or other UN agencies? And I think it's just worth being mindful that there are so many organizations that work in partnership. So for example, if you look at UNHCR, they have websites per country, and you can just go on the website and look at organizations that they work in partnership with. And then working with these organizations, you'll be doing very front-facing, similar work, often alongside UNHCR staff or in tandem with them. And I think it's worth thinking about why the UN? Why not an organization that's doing the same work, especially when it's going to give you the skills you need to leverage a position within the UN system anyway. I know it seems so attractive and exciting to work for the UN, but there's so many organizations out there, and lots of them have much more flexible visa restrictions than the UN would as well. And I was looking, for example, at a job in Egypt where I would have been doing refugee decision appeals. So in Egypt, the UNHCR determines refugee status, and this organization worked alongside UNHCR to support people in appealing decisions where there was insufficient evidence or lack of credibility and such. And I think that there are so many segues into working in similar roles. And they would naturally, I think, guide you to be a really competitive candidate eventually for a role like this. But Relief World is a fantastic organization that also lists so many international roles. And a lot of them do require professional experience, but quite a lot of them are actually entry level. And if you can, like you said, visas, it's such a small part of this talk, but it's actually such a massive hurdle. I'm a British citizen, and now that we've left the EU, I realized it's so limited in the roles that I could apply for. And that felt like a really big barrier to entering the sort of world of international work. So I think you just have to be, I think I was checking it probably daily. You have to just be really, really on top of opportunities when they come up. And I think you just have to be very flexible in where you start. But there are other ways to access the kind of work that the UN does. As a young person.
Anything else would you like to add?
I think it's been covered. Just a couple of things. Looking at ways of building up a career which may lead to the UN later in life. A significant number of people who work in the UN came from government service. So people working for national governments can relatively easily move over to work in the United Nations. I think also, even though you didn't experience this, I think for national staff, people are locally recruited. Certainly in some of the agencies, maybe not UNHCR, but in some of the agencies, such as the UN Development Programme, a lot of the international staff did start as national, locally recruited staff. I know from my last assignment in China, since I left, about 3 or 4 from my office have now gone on to international assignments.
Great. Before we move on to the Q&A session, I'm going to ask a final question, more like a curiosity, personal curiosity, let's say. But was the UN the ultimate objective for you, or is it something that occurred without looking for it by chance? Any of you would like to start this?
It wasn't.
It wasn't.
It wasn't my objective. I think I mentioned. I knew I wanted to work in something that was very sort of purpose driven. So I went into NGOs. It didn't occur to me, but for me, the happenstance was starting with UNICEF in the UK, and then what that opened up to me in terms of who I was working with, how I was working with them. So no.
Yeah. Same. I think I already kind of covered that, but I didn't know exactly what the UN did in terms of development. Didn't really come up in my courses much. So spending 2 years in Ghana really opened my eyes to the possibilities, because I think, as someone said, it's very much we work together with the local government and the local population. We don't impose on the government or on the local population, and it's very much a different way of working on development.
Yeah, that's the full house. 3 no's, definitely not. My objective truly is to work with refugees and with displaced people, and progress their rights in any way that I can. And I think I actually realized, being legally qualified, even within the UN system, I think that there's more to do with that backing. So qualifying, it definitely felt like a first. But I think that the UN system does so much valuable work. But if your objective is to work in the UN system and not really driven by the core values and the passions that you have, I'd probably encourage you to reassess your motivation really to work for the UN, because I think that the best people that I've seen at the UN, they're there because they're driven by their passions and their beliefs and their values, not because they want to work. And it is a very impressive and exciting place to work, but you can still push the same things from so many different directions. And I wouldn't be disheartened because you're not going to get a job at the UN when you graduate. Like, there are so many other ways to meaningfully contribute to the sort of wider mission that the UN stands for. And I think that the more you focus on that and focus on accumulating those skills and that experience, the more likely you will be to get this role. But I also think that the better candidate and sort of person that you will be when you get there as well.
All right, great, Ria. Thank you very much. Cool. I think we're good to open up to the floor. We're going to do this the old-fashioned way. So please raise your hand, state your name, and maybe your affiliation if you have any questions, and also if you have questions from online straight away. Yeah.
Okay, so the first question from online is, would you recommend going for one of the big cities like New York, London, or would you recommend going where the mission is being implemented, or would you say you should go to like your national mission within the UN? Which path would you say is the best?
Well, I think as someone who went, to a city and to London, I feel like I missed out on seeing what the core work of the UN does. And of course, there's so much diplomacy, and I, spent a lot of time working on policy, and all of that does feel really important. But especially, I guess maybe I'm just biased in the context of working with refugees and displaced people. I definitely feel like the field work and the operations on the ground are where you can make some of the most meaningful contributions, but also where I think you'll feel closer and more connected to the causes that the UN is working against and working for. And I think if you have only worked in these, countries where you're not dealing with the issues firsthand, you're sort of, living a much more different lifestyle. There's almost that you don't want to be out of touch, I think, in the context that you're working for. So I think I would definitely encourage people, whether it's through the UN or not, get field experience and know the causes that you're working with, being far removed. I think there might be a perspective shift.
I mean, realistically, I'm not sure people can pick and choose so easily now. I think you have to look across the spectrum of opportunities, but certainly in the humanitarian agencies, the ones I worked in, because you rotate, you can experience all of that in the course of your career. You can be working in. I've got friends at UNICEF. One of my friends currently is running communications in Juba in South Sudan, but she also had 5 years in Geneva. In the second, not the headquarters. Well, she actually also worked in New York, but in Geneva, where they have a big office running global campaigns and communications. And she's been in Manila, and it's quite valuable in those agencies to have the field experience, and that's welcome in headquarters. And people move between the two, and that's that functional flexibility that I spoke about. So I don't think necessarily anyone is going to give you more of an advantage. It's just getting in, basically. That's the key. And being prepared to maybe do something that doesn't look quite so glamorous at first, just to get in and prove yourself and learn and find those, hopefully doors will open once you're in there. I don't know, Nicholas.
Well, I think you're right. You're both right. I mean, I think you need to have that flexibility to work in roles across the spectrum, whether it's at the headquarters level or regional level or the country level. You need to have that flexibility, whether it's at the beginning of your time at the UN or later on, you need to have it. But I also agree with you, because thinking back, if I'd started in New York, say at the Department of Economic and Social Affairs in the UN Secretariat in New York, as opposed to working in Ghana on practical issues, I wouldn't have stayed with the UN. I think working 2 years in a very bureaucratic environment in New York would have put me off working in the UN. Whereas being kind of more sleeves rolled up made me much more interested in it. But then, of course, later in my career, I did have to spend days, or weeks, or months of my life attending committee meetings in New York, so I saw both sides.
You mentioned earlier that when you're working for an organization like the UN, you kind of have to sometimes put your views aside, or like you have to kind of navigate that. Do you have any advice when you are working in an environment like that, how you can kind of sometimes put your views aside so you can go about your work properly while still maintaining, I guess, your moral foundation or your values and not letting go of what you stand for?
Well, you're working for a purpose and you're working for a goal, which hopefully is a good goal, that you're working for an outcome that you think is right. So your values aren't removed from that process. It's just how you are expressing personal views because you're representing the UN. And there's a way of doing that and conducting yourselves. And obviously you're negotiating with very high level and important stakeholders. So it's about the how and the why. Doesn't mean that you're not living your values still. Now, some people do find that very difficult. You know, they do feel maybe they want their agency to be a bit more outspoken. You're working in a very complex, plural, ambidextrous environment. You know, you can be working, some of these agencies, you can be working with government A, and government A could be one of your biggest donors that enables you to run your operations globally. But at the same time, they could be implementing a very hostile environment and pushing against some of the legal frameworks and conventions that you're working with. So this is very tricky. And so bringing in kind of, you know, getting heated about it and not, you do have to work in a diplomatic manner to kind of navigate those. I mean, you have far more experience, don't you, of this? So.
No, I mean, it is, I mean, you have some foundation documents from the UN Charter through to the various conventions, the Human Rights Convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and many others. And that does give you a framework. And you can certainly use those frameworks and quote from those frameworks. But I think that's not the same as having personal opinions, because those are frameworks that all of us in the UN work within. But they do give you that purpose-driven, that value-driven foundation framework to work within. The other thing I think is a lot of what work on normative issues that the UN does is process-driven. It's bringing different parties around a table, letting different views be expressed, seeing how to negotiate it, being a referee in a sense to remind people that these conventions do exist and you shouldn't go out of them, stray out of them. So I think in a party political sense, no. And you can even be fired for that. But I think you can be comfortable in the sense that there are numbers of conventions which can give you that kind of more normative basis for the work.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I definitely struggled with. Like I think I'm very activist and very firm in my beliefs and values. But I think the way that I looked at it, especially when I was dealing with situations where I wanted to be more outspoken than was expected in certain contexts, is that the UN is not perfect, and it is so restricted by the realities of the contexts and the world that it has to work in. And so a lot of the time it won't go as far as it can, or it won't do what it can, but it is, I think, the best system we have of international cooperation. And so having to understand that you have to maintain relationships with countries that, again, aren't doing things that we preferably would like them to be doing, or not treating people or cooperating in a way. But, you know, you have to protect the reputation, because I think a lot of the time, and especially when I was outside the UN, you don't quite know what's at stake and what kind of relationships they're trying to juggle and manage. And I think as a representative, of course, you have to refrain from your personal critique, because there's often a much bigger picture that I don't think the public, do fully understand or do are privy to.
You're right, and those agencies are there at the invitation of the government, and the government can decide that you are no longer welcome, or you as an individual can be persona non grata. So that's not really helping either, is it? If you shut your mouth and the operation is closed down, that's not helping the people that were meant to be there to serve, which has happened sometimes.
Like Rwanda's a really good example, actually, because the UK government were making arrangements that the UN, the UNHCR did step out and eventually say, they intervened and said this is unlawful, it's incompatible with international law, and they were really progressive in it. But it was really, really difficult for the country office in Rwanda trying to maintain good relationships with that domestic government, where they were quite happy about this deal, and it would have been quite a good thing for Rwanda, and trying to manage the impact that they're having in the UK, as well as the relationships they're having in Rwanda and the displaced people that they're also having to be present for and service in Rwanda. I think often it's just more complex than it is, and that's definitely what made me, I think, more understanding about the need to sometimes be quiet and diplomatic about things.
Thank you. Yep.
Thanks so much for your insights. My name's Amy. I'm doing an MA in presentation here, but I've also been a UK civil servant for a number of years, so it's quite heartening to hear your experience coming in a bit later. I wanted to go back to something that you said at the beginning, Nicholas, about the spectrum of views on whether the UN needs to reform or whether it should just weather the storm, and what your personal perspectives are on what the reform should be.
How long do you have?
Yeah, this is a bit beyond the careers, but yes, I think it's unfortunately all been accelerated by external events in certain countries. But I think we've been talking without doing enough for the last decade or two, well, since the 2000s, that the post-World War II structures of international governance are out of date. Not just the United Nations, but also the international finance institutions and the Bretton Woods. And one does have to renew these institutions and update them to serve the same purpose as they were serving when they were set up originally, and to bring back a little bit more fairness and equity into the governance arrangements for these organizations. If we don't do that, they risk becoming irrelevant, and other funding, if you're talking about the Bretton Woods, other funding mechanisms will come up. If you're talking about the United Nations, other mechanisms for peace and security will come up. So I think the need for change has been there, and it's certainly been loudly proclaimed by the current Secretary General, but also by previous Secretary Generals. The problem has been that for certain countries, and particularly for the P5, I think it is advantageous to keep things as they are, certainly in the short term. And I think that what has to be done is to have people who convince P5 members who have veto power at the Security Council that significant reform is also in their interest. So what a nice cliche, win-win. But I don't think that's been done. And however much effort has gone into coming up with interesting proposals, at the end of the day, you need large regional blocks plus large important economies, the P5 bloc, as well as regional blocks, to come together and agree. So I hope that happens. I mean, we heard at this event the other day that about the efforts to come up with a new form of the charter. And I think the momentum now is probably more than it has been in the past. But still, there are significant obstacles. But there is that risk of irrelevance if, after 80 years, we can't update the basic instruments of the Union.
Did anyone come on Saturday to hear the Secretary General speak? Was anybody there? That's really good to know. Yes, and
Were you there?
yeah, I was there.
I didn't see you.
No, I didn't see you. There were 2,000 people, weren't there? Yes, obviously there is the UN AT reform process led by the Secretary General. I don't think anyone doesn't think reform isn't needed to maintain its relevance. And then he was on, you probably heard him on the Today programme. He did quite an interview there and acknowledges that the Security Council isn't working in its current format and its revision. And I also think many colleagues in the UN, probably most, do believe that to make it more effective and more efficient, reforms are needed. There's been kind of mission creep that's happened. There's duplication. So there's definitely, I think everyone agrees, this is an opportunity to reset, and that's very important. But he also said on Saturday, or someone said, the UN wasn't created to take people to heaven, it was to prevent them from falling into hell. It may be imperfect, but if it didn't exist, it would have to be invented. Because if you imagine a world without it, actually, what often doesn't hit the news are the wars that have prevented, the conflicts that are averted, the famine that hasn't happened. That's not news, actually. So it's quite hard also to really prove the full impact of the UN, because it's prevented things quite often, and that's hard.
I think you covered the ground, and you definitely both know the system far better than I do. But I think, like the permanent 5 seems like a very, very difficult thing to keep justifying in the current climate. And I always think that the General Assembly should probably have more influence and power, especially when you're talking about we've seen all the resolutions fail about the conflict in Palestine, and I think it is really, really disheartening. But then at the same time, it's not the best thing, but it's the only thing that we have, and it you should never disparage countries from international cooperation. But I think everyone is in agreement that it does need a sincere reform. Like, it was drafted nearly 80 years ago, and the shoe doesn't still fit anymore. It needs to change.
I think time allows for one more question. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on surveillance and interception by member states in the UN and cyber attacks?
We want to focus this more on the careers of the UN and less on politics of the UN. You guys would like to answer this?
So try to merge it with another one.
Yes. Do you have any questions about careers in particular?
How can careers in the UN be more accessible for people who are looking to get in? Because I feel like one of the stories that you've said is, in my time it was a lot easier at this point of, and I kind of stumbled upon it, but it also feels like there's sort of that glorification of the grind of, had to work a lot of, for many years, had to kind of accumulate all these skills. So do you think, I think it's a two-part question, do you think careers at the UN should be more accessible? Do you think that should happen?
Well, they have to be accessible to people from every country of the world, remember, and there are a finite number of jobs. So, that's the reality, because it needs to be diverse. Every government would like to know that some of their people are working for the UN. That's important, I think. That's fundamental, is that breadth of diversity. And therefore, by definition, particularly if jobs are shrinking a bit, it is going to be competitive. And I think we're just being really honest about that in terms of how it is hard to get in, but you can build your careers in other arenas and find routes in if you don't find an entry straight away. As we've gone through, there are some opportunities at entry level through internships, short-term consultancies, if not posts, but never to devalue building your career in other organisations, other sectors. And who knows, you may find that you are so fulfilled and are fully participating and contributing in that career that you don't feel the need to work for the UN, or you work for an implementing partner and you partner that way. But there are routes in. It's just about being smart and not focusing solely on it to the detriment of anything else, is I think what we're saying, isn't it?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
Amazing, cool. This will be the end of our panel. Thank you very much for your insights. Let's have a big round of applause. Appreciation. We have some flowers coming now.
I thought they were running off to watch the traitors or something. I'd just anywhere else. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. That's very kind.
And just as a reminder, we do have applications closed, but we're still considering quite late applications. So if you're interested, please do go ahead and scan the QR code or find us on lyme.org.uk/apply UC 2026. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.